I think Vancouver's significance, as I said earlier, lies in a different place, in its emblematic historical importance. It's part of a story that began about 500 years ago. A story you would never have predicted. If you'd gone on a world tour, let's say you'd gone on a world tour in the early 1400s, and you'd been asked to predict which part of the world is going to dominate it, you would not have picked Western Europe. You would have been far more impressed by the then Ming capital, Nanjing, than you would have been by London, which was a far smaller and yet far smellier city. You would not have picked Portugal to lead the Western conquest of the world. You would have thought that the western end of Eurasia was a pretty nasty neighborhood of fragmented, quarreling states, riven with civil war, and periodically devastated by plague. You'd have thought more highly of the Ottoman Empire than of any of the kingdoms of Europe. And yet, from the late 15th century onwards, almost without interruption, for 5 centuries, the story of world economic history was the story of ascendancy. What do I mean by that? Well, let me illustrate it with a very simple statistic. I know it's a little late, and some of you have had at least 3 glasses of wine, so let's take this slowly. Per capita gross domestic product is a pretty basic measure of average income. So imagine taking the per capita gross domestic product of North America and dividing it by the per capita gross domestic product of China. So, average American income divided by average Chinese income. In the year 1500, in fact, that ratio would have been below unity because the average Chinese was richer than the average North American in the year 1500. Quite a bit richer. By 1978, the average American was at least 20 times to 0 times richer than the average Chinese. And that is an understatement because it's based on something called purchasing power parity, which is very nerdy, but you need to know it. So this allows for the fact that a haircut in Nanjing is way cheaper than a haircut in Vancouver. So non-tradables, you compensate for the fact that the purchasing power varies significantly. If you don't do that, if you just calculate it in current dollar terms, in 1978, the average American was about 70 times richer than the average Chinese. And this wasn't a peculiarity of North America. The average Brit was about 15 times richer than the average Indian, and so on. This is what we call the Great Divergence. An incredible opening up of inequality, a global imbalance unlike anything ever seen before. And it wasn't just a matter of income. In terms of life expectancy, in the mid-20th century, the average Westerner had a life expectancy twice that of the average non-Westerner. Westerners got taller. They were healthier during their lives. They had more leisure time, and so on. And in geopolitics too. The story of that period from 1500 to the late 1970s is essentially a story of Western dominance, power. The great European empires, of which this country was once a part, accounted in 1913 for close to 60% of the world's land surface and population, and 3/4 at least of its total economic output. And there were just 11 of these European empires, of which the British was the biggest, plus the United States, which had entered the empire game in the 1890s. We talk these days about global imbalances as if they somehow caused the financial crisis. It wasn't me, it was global imbalances. these were the real global imbalances of the modern era. Massive inequality. And these inequalities persist. Credit Suisse did a good report on global wealth a year or so ago. It's astonishing to find that roughly 2/3 of the known financial assets in the world are owned by Westerners, who account now for less than 1/5 of the world's population. The Great Divergence is the single hardest thing to explain in human history. It's not immediately obvious why people originating in the warring, strife-torn kingdoms of Europe should have taken over the world, which they did. It is not easy to explain why, with a kind of sense of certainty that we would struggle to emulate today, people could come here to this remote Pacific coast and start a new city like Vancouver from scratch. That's what my book tries to explain. I was warned by the lovely Leah that some of you might have read it. Can I just explain to you that all an author cares about is that you buy his book? For those of you, I assume the majority, who haven't read it, I'm now going to tell you what it says, and you can subsequently pretend to have read it. This is what academics do all the time, so don't feel bad. It's not national character. It certainly isn't race. It's not geography either. If you've read Jared Diamond's Guns, Germs and Steel, forget all you read. Because geography, which is his great explanation, doesn't explain this at all. Europe had the same geography in the year 1000 as it had in 1500, and for 500 years, nothing happened. National identity? I'll tell you why that doesn't really matter. Imagine an experiment. Let's take a single population, homogeneous, speaking the same language, same history, same traditions, same funny national costumes. Let's divide them in two, and let's give one half communist institutions, the other half capitalist institutions, and let's see what happens. If national character matters, then there should not be any significant change. But we know it doesn't matter, because we ran this experiment not only in Germany, but also in Korea. And guess what? Within a few years of new institutions being introduced, behavior dramatically diverged. In West Germany, they continued to produce really good cars. In East Germany, they produced the Trabant. Your lawnmower is more powerful than the Trabant. You'd overtake a Trabant in your lawnmower. The key argument of my book is that it's institutions, what Adam Smith called the laws and institutions of a society that matter. Take any society in any geography you like, with any religion, any culture you choose, give that society the right institutions, and behavior will change, and prosperity and peace will very quickly ensue if they're the right institutions. So the key question is, what are the right institutions? What are the things that really mattered that made the West suddenly, after 500 years of doing nothing, more successful than everybody else? 20 times more successful, at least. Why? So I have this facile way of explaining an idea, which is designed to appeal to my teenage children. Some of you were here when I should have been here, and instead I sent my wife, which was very sweet of her. And you know that, maybe you don't know, but we have a 3-month-old son. So if I lose the thread of what I'm saying, it's exhaustion. But I also have 3 teenage children, and my life's work is to try and interest them in what I do. So I thought, if you only read one history book, son, my son is now 18, so if they just read one between the YouTube videos and the text messages to the girlfriend and all the rest of it, read this book, and it's going to explain about 600 years of world history in terms of 6 killer apps. Imagine if I'd said to him, and it's going to explain 600 years of world history in terms of 6 key institutions and ideas. I'd have lost him. So killer apps was my way of trying to engage the interest of my teenage son. If it seems annoying and irritating to you as a concept, I'm sorry. But it's more memorable. And it's not a bad analogy, actually, if you take out your phone. If you click on an app, wonderful stuff happens. It's just an icon, you tap it, and bingo. It looks simple, but underlying it is highly complex computer code that not one person in this room could probably understand. What I'm talking about is like that. The institutions and ideas that made the West successful were in fact highly complex, but they look simple. And when I describe them to you, they'll sound simple. 1, competition. 2, the scientific revolution. 3, the rule of law. 4, modern medicine. 5, the consumer society. 6, the work ethic. My argument is that these 6 things together determine the success of the West. At a time when China was ruled by a monolithic empire, the West was fragmented into multiple competing states, and within those states there was competition. At a time when technological innovation had essentially stopped in China and got into reverse in the Muslim world, the scientific revolution happened in Europe, exclusively in Europe. And that 17th century revolution in thought transformed the world. The rule of law based on private property rights is something that you all take completely for granted. And yet, until John Locke set out the theory that freedom was bound up with private property, that was not the basis for human organization or the rule of law anywhere. So that counts. From the late 19th century onwards, meaningful medical advances literally doubled life expectancy, but at first only in the West. The consumer society. Well, we've all become slightly disapproving of that. But actually, without it, there would have been no industrial revolution. Let me illustrate the point. This is time for a little audience participation. Because by now, half of you have zoned out. Put your hand up if in the last 2 months you bought an article of clothing. Any article of clothing. Be honest. Sir? I was going to say that suit looks a little bit frayed anyway. I can give you the address of an extremely good tailor in Hong Kong. We all buy clothes. We buy clothes in a way quite different from the way in which we buy food. Our demand for clothing is almost infinitely elastic. If you don't believe me, I'll show you my teenage daughter's wardrobe. Why does that matter? Because without it, there's no point having an industrial revolution. An industrial revolution primarily is about lowering the unit cost of cotton clothes. That's what it's about. And every single industrial revolution, beginning with the English, going right down, recent in countries like Vietnam, is about reducing the price of clothing. It would be pointless if we didn't all want crazy amounts of clothing. I want to suggest to you, Not only that these 6 killer apps are the key to understanding why the West came to dominate